let's talk a little bit about permanent cosmetics because it is one of my favorite things to do, and I feel like I do know quite a bit about it. So let me pass on a little bit of what I know that a consumer should know when they're looking at getting their brows or liner or lips done. So brows are the most popular permanent cosmetic procedure. I started doing brows 5, 6 years ago before microblading was popular. So I first learned on a tattoo machine. So that is very different than microblading. And sometimes the consumers don't really understand the difference. So I'd like to touch on that because that's probably one of the most confusing things that we get when people call in for brows is them not knowing what technique they need or prefer. And so, then it's not booked accordingly or with the right person, and then it's just confusing. So microblading is great. It's a very trendy thing right now. It requires much less training. It is cheaper training. The supplies are cheaper, and so that has led to an influx of artists. We have a lot of great artists in our area, lots of talented people. But microblading is not for everyone. So these are the differences. Microblading is great for drier skin, normal to dry skin, and aged skin. That is because when we apply the pigment, we are using a hand piece with a blade in it that looks like this. So this blade, it's not a blade, it's a pin needle, is 14 needles. That's a 14 slant or a 14 slope, depending on what you call it. And we dip that needle into pigment, and then we essentially cut it into the skin. There's a few things that every artist has to be careful of. One, that they're not tipping that handpiece so that they're not cutting that pigment in at an angle, because when they do that, instead of it healing into a sharp, crisp hair stroke, it's going under the skin at a diagonal, which leads to a blurred out, healed result. It is not hard to get a great after photo. Most clients look great right when they're done. It's the healed photo a month, 2 months later, even a year later is kind of when you really learn what you need to practice on and where your faults are, because your work should heal well over time, over a year to 2 years. Microblading is not semi-permanent. It is permanent. It doesn't last forever. It will need touch-ups, but it would be very far-fetched to find someone who had microblading done that had absolutely nothing left in a year. It is tattooing. So it depends a lot on pressure, technique, the artist and their experience, what hand pieces and needle sizes they're using. Different needles should be used for different skin types and different looks per se, but overall microblading is a more natural hair stroke look for people with normal to dry skin. Great in the range of like 40 to 60-year-olds usually have really good skin tones. If people have oily skin, large pores, and a lot of younger girls are better candidates for tattoo machine work. And the reason is because their skin is oilier, and they're not going to heal with a crisp hair stroke look. If they try to microblade, once that pigment goes through the different layers of skin and hits the oil production in the skin, that oil pushes that pigment around, leading into a blurred, filled in look. So they're not going to have crisp, it's not going to be a disaster by any means. It could still be very beautiful, but instead of having crisp hair stroke lines of hairs, they're going to have more of a filled, blurred brow shape. So they're gonna get kind of a machine look anyway with microblading. Microblading makes it pressure is very important with microblading, and that just takes a long time to get down. And what can happen is it's hard to go soft enough with microblading because you're essentially cutting skin. And if you cut too deep, the color can ash out and go gray or blue. Because you've hit that blood level. You've gone too low, too deep into the skin. And it's harder to do that with machine work. So your color's a little more true. It's a little easier. it's harder to go, let's put it this way. When I did machine work for 4 or 5 years before microblading, I never had one purple or blue or gray ashy eyebrow ever, that whole time. I just thought I was super lucky. And then once I started microblading, one, the pigments are different. They need to be modified. Color theory is a must for microbladers. It's not so much for machine work. It's still very important, but you can still do a good job without it. I don't think it's very possible to be good at microblading and not know color theory really well and the chemistry behind it, because it's just too easy to go too deep, and that's when you get those ashy blue brows. Also with microblading, it's very important that the artist not cross strokes over each other. So if you're cutting a hair stroke, the next hair stroke needs to lay next to it. It can't cross over it. Anywhere that those hair strokes cross, you're gonna get a blowout, and that pigment is going to turn ashy. It's gonna blow, because you have double the pigment at that intersection of the two strokes, and so it's not uniform. You have double saturation in this one little area. It looks fine right when you're done. It looks great, and then 3 or 4 months down the road, I'm usually taking a laser to just one spot where we have two intersecting strokes. It's a lot more noticeable 4 to 6 months down the road, whereas with machine work, that isn't an issue. So those are your differences. Machine work brows they're bolder. They're a lot more saturated because there's more pigment put into the area. Either people love them or they hate them. I never know until they're on my table. But I will tell you they heal a lot softer than they look right when they're done. I like to say that the women that should probably go for a machined brow, a filled brow, or a fusion brow, per se, are those that wear a lot of makeup, or they wear lash extensions, or they have full lips and like to wear lipstick, and they like a bolder look. They look beautiful with a very sculpted filled brow. My clients that are a little more natural, they don't wear as much makeup, or they have alopecia, or they've lost their skin from cancer treatments, they're great microblading candidates because they get a more natural look that way. I did a fill on my brows Friday. They were like black Saturday and Sunday. Most people would have been like, oh, which I love that look, but most don't. And now you can see I'm still peeling and scabbing a little bit, but they soften up a ton. So this is a filled tattoo machined brow on me. No microblading in there. I like to jump back and forth. So I microbladed myself about a year ago, and then I did a machine fill Friday. And then next year, I'll probably microblade. And then the next year, I'll do a machine fill. So I like to go back and forth. I think that looks really, really nice. But my main point was to explain the different skin types, the kind of brows that they require. Not everybody is a candidate for microblading. Most everybody is a candidate for machine work if they like the outcome and the look. It's a little longer wearing brow. And for the first week, you do look a little intense, per se. You could go to work right after a microblading appointment and look great. You'd actually look fantastic. Right after a filled brow appointment, you're gonna have a very bold, sculpted, defined out brow. So I hope that helps. Ask me any questions you want. I absolutely love this topic. I don't know that there's many questions I can't answer, so ask me whatever you would like to, and we can chat.